they said the air in Willow Vale was thick with sorcery. But to those who had walked its winding paths before dawn, it smelled only of damp earth and the sweetness of crushed nettle leaves. The stream whispered softly between moss-covered stones, and the wind carried no curse, only the sigh of the forest turning in its sleep. In a hut at the edge of the vale lived a woman named Elenya. Her hands were always warm, even in winter, and children often said her touch silenced the pain in their bruises. She did not pray to the saints but spoke to the herbs as though they were old companions. Some said that was enough to call down suspicion. In times when faith was brittle and fear was iron, gentleness could be mistaken for rebellion. Her husband had died long ago, a nameless soldier swallowed by some border skirmish the crown would forget before spring. Since then, Elenya lived in quiet solitude, tending to the sick, the dying, and the desperate. People came at night, mothers with fevered infants, farmers with festering wounds, and left coins, bread, or nothing at all. She asked for no payment, only silence. But silence is fragile in small villages. Words rot quickly when left in the dark. By the time the steward of Lord Murrin heard of her miracles, they were no longer tender stories of healing, they were warnings of an unnatural woman who spoke to the dead, whose shadow moved when she did not. No one truly believed it, and yet, no one truly doubted, either. Fear does not need faith to grow, it only needs a whisper. That winter was harsher than any before. Cattle died in the fields, frostbite took children in their sleep, and the village priest, young, zealous, desperate for order, declared that sin had settled upon them. He spoke of purity and fire, of purging evil so the soil might breathe again. His sermons filled the air with smoke long before the pyres were lit. Elenya listened from her doorway as his voice carried across the snow, each word heavy as a stone in her chest. She did not flee, though she knew the sound of footsteps that would come for her. She merely watched the crows circling above the bare trees, their cries cutting through the silence like the tolling of unseen bells. In the stillness of her hut, she whispered to the dried lavender hanging from the rafters, "The world fears what it cannot heal." The herbs, of course, gave no answer. But the wind sighed through the cracks in the wood, and for a moment, it almost sounded like prayer. The summons came at dawn. A single knock, hollow, deliberate, echoed through the chill. When Elenya opened her door, frost cracked beneath her bare feet. 3 men stood before her, the steward, the priest, and a guard whose eyes could not meet hers. Behind them, the valley still slept, veiled in mist. By order of his lordship Murrin, the steward announced, "You are to be brought before the council on charges of heresy and witchcraft." Elenya did not argue. She only took her shawl, coarse wool, smelling faintly of rosemary and ash, and stepped into the whiteness. Her hut, small and patient, remained behind her like a faithful ghost. The path to the manor was steep, and each step felt like a memory sinking into snow. The hall where they gathered her was northwest Grand Court, only a cold chamber lined with banners faded to the color of old blood. The priest stood nearest the hearth, his breath visible in the still air. His hands trembled not from fear but from fervor. "You consort with spirits," he said. "You heal without prayer. You whisper to roots, not to the Lord." Elenya lifted her gaze to him. Her eyes, gray as winter water, held no defiance, only a weary mercy. "I speak," she said softly, "to what still listens." That answer, quiet and unyielding, unsettled the room. The priest turned away as though scorched by her calm. The steward cleared his throat and asked the formal questions. Did she know charms? Had she uttered curses? Had she lain with the devil in dreams? To each, she replied with the same gentle truth, "No. I only mend what's broken." But truth, like a wounded bird, cannot always fly through fear. Outside, villagers gathered to hear her name called a witch. Their faces were pale with hunger, their hearts seeking someone to blame. When the priest raised his hand and cried, "Confess, so your soul may yet be saved," a murmur spread like fire through dry grass. Elenya's silence was her only rebellion. The more they shouted, the more she seemed to fade from their fury, her stillness terrifying in its grace. That night, she was placed in the cellar beneath the manor. The walls sweated salt, and the air was thick with mold and iron. Through the cracks above, she could hear the murmur of the guards, their laughter dissolving into unease when the wind moaned across the valley. She sat upon the cold stone and closed her eyes, thinking of her hut, the scent of mint crushed beneath her palms, the warmth of a child's fevered forehead cooling under her touch. In the dark, she wondered what sin there was in kindness. Whether mercy, when unblessed by ritual, became heresy. Whether the stars themselves, bright, distant, silent, watched all this and pitied her. For a long while, there was only stillness. Then, softly, she began to hum an old song, a lullaby her mother once sang before the plague took her. The melody drifted through the cracks, winding upward into the frostbitten air. And those who heard it swore that the night grew warmer. But the priest, kneeling in his chamber, thought it sounded like temptation. Days passed without sun. The valley lay under a shroud of snow, and the sky itself seemed made of lead. In the manor's cellar, Elenya waited. The guards no longer spoke when they brought her water, they set it down and fled quickly, as though her calm might spread like a sickness. Above, the council debated what to do. Lord Murrin was not a cruel man, only cautious. His lands had suffered famine, and the people's faith wavered like a candle in the wind. Fear demanded sacrifice, and the priest had named her as the offering. To spare her would be to invite unrest, to condemn her would restore control. Power, in such times, was not about justice, it was about quieting the tremor in men's hearts. On the third night, the priest came to her cell. He carried a lantern whose flame trembled as though afraid to stay. He spoke softly, as if to a dying child. "Elenya," he said, "you are given one last chance to save your soul. Confess that you served the devil, and the Lord may forgive you before the fire takes you." She looked up from the floor, where frost had begun to bloom along the stones like pale flowers. "You think confession buys mercy," she said. "But mercy cannot be bought, it must be believed in. And belief has left this place." Her words unsettled him. The priest shifted his weight, his face tight with the struggle between pity and duty. "You speak as if faith were dead." "Not dead," she replied, "only buried beneath fear. You've mistaken the two for the same." The lantern's flame flared, then dimmed. For a heartbeat, their shadows danced against the walls, two shapes locked in quiet defiance, the man of faith and the woman of doubt, though in truth, it was the other way around. When he left, Elenya pressed her hand to the floor, feeling the earth's cold pulse beneath her. Time slowed there. She thought of her mother's voice, of the scent of time after rain, of the stream that whispered to her hut. Each memory felt like a small light, and she gathered them carefully, as though they might follow her into what waited beyond. That night, she dreamed, not of fire, but of water. She walked through a river that shimmered beneath a pale moon, its current neither cold nor warm. The voices of those she had healed rose from its depths, not accusing, but gentle. "Rest," they said. "You gave what the world refused to understand." When she woke, the first sound she heard was the cry of a raven. It perched above the barred window, black against the morning gray. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt an odd comfort. The raven tilted its head, as if to say, "The living and the dead both have wings, they only differ in silence." By noon, the council's decision was made. The priest did not announce it himself. It came as a whisper through the cellar door, "Tomorrow, at dawn." Elenya nodded once, though no one saw. Her breath hung before her, white and trembling. She thought then of time, not as the measure of hours, but as the slow turning of mercy into memory. "Everything passes," she mused. "Even fire." And when she closed her eyes again, she was not afraid. Only sorrowful for those who still were. Morning came with the weight of prophecy. The snow had hardened overnight into a crust that cracked beneath every step. The villagers gathered before dawn, drawn not by cruelty but by the terrible gravity of ritual. They did not want to see her burn, yet they came, as though witnessing might cleanse them of the quiet complicity that haunted their sleep. The pyre stood in the meadow beyond the chapel, a dark mound of wood slick with frost. Smoke from the torches drifted lazily upward, veiling the world in a gray half-light. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to cry but was quickly hushed. The priest stood near the front, his hands clasped tight enough to draw blood. He told himself it was for the sake of order, of faith, of the souls trembling behind him. But in the hollow of his chest, something whispered, "And what of her soul?" Elenya was led through the crowd with her wrists bound by a single cord. Her hair, streaked with silver, brushed against her shoulders as the wind stirred. There was no defiance in her face, only an unbearable stillness. The villagers watched her as one might watch the falling of a star, awed, terrified, and uncertain what its passing might mean. When she reached the pyre, she looked once to the sky. The clouds were the color of pewter, and the faintest trace of dawn painted their edges with reluctant gold. A raven circled above, its cry the only voice that dared break the silence. The priest stepped forward to speak the words of condemnation. His voice wavered, then steadied. Elenya of Willow Vale, you are found guilty of consorting with the devil and practicing forbidden arts. By the will of Lord Murren, and for the salvation of this land, you shall be cleansed in fire. Her gaze met his. There was no anger, no plea. Only the quiet sorrow of one who has already understood too much. Father, she said softly, if fire could cleanse the world, it would have done so long ago. He flinched as though struck. The words echoed, fragile yet unyielding. For a moment, the crowd wavered, caught between fear and doubt. But the guard moved forward, placing the torch at the base of the pyre. Flame met frost with a hiss, and smoke coiled upward like a prayer denied. At first, the fire struggled to live. Then, with a breath of wind, it rose, orange, red, alive. The crackle filled the air, mingling with the murmurs of the watchers. The smell was sharp and ancient, burning pine, resin, cloth, and sorrow. Elenya closed her eyes. In the dark behind her lids, she saw her hut again, the hanging herbs, the glint of water, the soft laughter of children she had once healed. The fire's heat pressed closer, but her thoughts were cool, distant, like rain that never fell. As the flames climbed higher, she whispered, not to the priest, nor to the crowd, but to the wind itself. Let mercy outlive fear. Those closest swore they heard it, though no lips moved. Others said the smoke rose in the shape of wings. The priest fell to his knees, his hands trembling in prayer, or perhaps in shame. When the fire finally died, the ashes drifted across the snow like gray petals. The meadow was silent, save for the whisper of wind through the charred wood. By evening, nothing remained but the scent of rosemary. And in the heart of the vale, where no one dared to walk, new green shoots began to push through the thawing ground. The seasons turned, as they always do, though no one in Willow Vale spoke her name again. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the memory of Elenya, leaving behind only the echo of what had been done. The meadow where the pyre once stood became a place the villagers avoided. Even the children, fearless in their games, would not run near it. The grass grew there differently, paler, almost silver, and when the wind passed through, it carried a strange fragrance, half smoke, half sweetness, as though the air itself could not decide between mourning and peace. Years passed. Lord Murren died of fever, his lands divided among sons who cared little for the faith that had once governed their father's hand. The priest, now gray and hollow-eyed, still served in the chapel, though his sermons had grown quieter. He spoke less of fire and purity, and more of forgiveness, though he never said for whom. Each dawn, he would walk to the meadow and stand before the soft rise of earth that marked where the ashes had fallen. There, he prayed, but his words dissolved into the mist. He prayed not for the village, nor even for himself, but for the woman whose calm had haunted his dreams. In them, she never burned. She only looked at him as she had that day, with a gaze so patient it felt eternal. And in those dreams, she always said the same thing. Mercy cannot live where fear is worshipped. He grew old beneath the weight of that sentence. In the winters that followed, the village suffered still, though now the people blamed the weather, not witches. They worked the soil, bore their children, buried their dead. Yet something had changed. The healer's craft, once forbidden, began to return quietly through the hands of others. Women learned again the ways of herb and salve, passing the knowledge in whispers as their grandmothers once had. No one called it witchcraft anymore. They simply called it care. Sometimes, travelers spoke of strange things in the vale, of lights that flickered at the edge of the woods, of a voice in the wind that seemed to hum when sickness waned. A shepherd once claimed he had seen a woman standing among the willow trees, her shawl trailing like smoke, her hands cupped as though holding something invisible and fragile. When he blinked, she was gone, but the fevered lamb he had carried to her was found well the next morning. The villagers listened, half believing, half afraid to believe. It was easier to think the land had forgiven them than to imagine she had. And so life continued. The priest died one spring evening, kneeling before the altar, his lips forming a name that no one remembered. His body was laid in the chapel's yard, and though the people prayed as they always did, a gentle rain fell throughout the service, washing the earth clean. When the storm passed, the clouds parted, and a single ray of light fell upon the meadow, the one they no longer entered. The silver grass glowed for a moment, then swayed softly, as though bowing to something unseen. The wind carried a whisper through the vale. Those who heard it said it sounded almost like a blessing. Centuries later, the name Elenya lingered only in the dust of forgotten ledgers and the half-faded lines of an old parish record. The ink had bled, the parchment brittle as the bones of time itself. Few could still read the script, and fewer still cared to try. Yet one winter evening, a traveling scholar, a man of quiet manner and gentle eyes, came upon those pages while sheltering in the ruins of the old manor. The fire in his hearth was small, and the wind hissed through the gaps in the stone. By its wavering light, he traced the name again and again, until it seemed to breathe through the parchment. Elenya of Willow Vale, it read, executed for heresy, 1426. May her soul be judged and forgiven. Forgiven. The word struck him strangely. It was not the usual phrasing. Most records of such trials spoke of punishment, of justice, of the triumph of faith. But this one, this single word, was tender, almost human. The scholar closed his eyes and listened to the wind curling through the ruins. It carried a faint scent, earth, smoke, and something floral, like wild thyme crushed underfoot. He felt, absurdly, as though the walls themselves remembered. He rose, stepped outside, and looked toward the vale. The meadow was still there, though the chapel and village had long since decayed into silence. Only the willows remained, tall and watchful, their branches swaying like slow, solemn dancers. Snow fell softly among them, and the air was very still, as if holding its breath. He walked down to the place where the earth rose slightly, the mound where rumor said a pyre had once burned. No marker stood there, only a scatter of stones and, improbably, a single sprig of rosemary growing green in the frost. He knelt, brushed the snow from its leaves, and felt the faint warmth of life against his fingers. So, he murmured, you endured. A raven's call broke the silence above him, echoing through the hollow hills. The scholar looked up, following the black shape wheeling against the sky. It felt less like an omen than a witness. He thought then of how time rearranges guilt into memory, and memory into myth. How those called heretics often hold the gentlest truths. And how every age finds new pyres, new words for fear, and new names for mercy. As the snow deepened, he wrote by lamplight, his breath clouding the air. Some say she was a witch. Some say she was a healer. I think she was only human. Which, in those days, was the most dangerous thing to be. When morning came, he left the vale quietly. But he took with him a cutting of that rosemary, pressing it between the pages of his journal. Years later, that same herb would grow in the courtyard of a distant monastery. The monks who tended it would not know its origin, only that it thrived even in the hardest winters. They would crush its leaves for the sick, hang it above their doors for peace, and tell each other, in whispers, that the plant was a gift once carried by a saint. Perhaps, in some way, it was. And so the story of Elenya of Willow Vale dissolved into the slow forgetting that claims all things. Yet the wind, when it passes through old willows in winter, still seems to hum, a sound not of mourning, but of remembrance. It carries neither accusation nor prayer, only a truth the world has never quite learned to keep. That kindness, though it burns, leaves roots the fire cannot touch.